get started. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. So we have Eamon McCarthy-Earl here tonight, who's going to give us a brief talk on the Wachusett Reservoir. He also brought some materials in the back that he can talk about after. We're very excited to have him here. Just give us a little bit of the history of the Wachusett Reservoir. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Lydia. And thank you very much for all coming out this evening to join me for the story of the Wachusett Reservoir. As I was commenting a second ago, it's great to see a packed house. You never can count on one when you're giving speeches at a library. So it's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. I'm certainly passionate about this topic. It's fascinating, the subject of where our water comes from. And something that's always in the news these days. It's like water resources are very topical whenever you think about things that are going on in the world today. And so this is a really interesting story that will take us from the 19th century right up to the present day, and is deeply intertwined with sort of the Natural River Valley, greater Fitchburg, greater Lunenburg part of the world. Apple Country, as some have dubbed it after Johnny Appleseed and others originated in this part of the world. And we'll see how this project, begun almost 130 years ago, transformed 4 towns in the region and had broader impacts that reach as far away as places like Lunenburg. So, without further ado, let's get started. This is an image from Boston's Common back in 1848. This lithograph shows a huge celebration in the year 1848. That marked the opening of what was essentially the city's first reservoir, like what's current-day Lake Wachusett, Framingham, and Wayland, Mass. Technically, the city had a small reservoir, actually a couple of them beforehand. They're currently, the left behinds are Jamaica Pond and Middlesex Fells, right in and around Boston. But those were really stopgap measures for a city that had grown so rapidly from colonial times to what we see here in the mid-1800s. Boston had been one of the boom towns of early America. In fact, Boston had a brief little blip of a moment where it was the biggest city in the 13 colonies. Very short blip, got quickly eclipsed by Philadelphia and New York, which vied for the #1 spot throughout most of colonial times and into the early Republic. But Boston was always in the top 2 or 3, or they sort of sank down the list as Baltimore and ground post crept up the list, but it was always among the largest cities in early America. And Boston was very well situated where it was originally. It was on a little peninsula, so it was protected against Native American attack. But because of its particular geography, it was very, very poor on groundwater. Essentially, the soil was a munge of just bad leftover stuff from the glaciers 15,000 years ago. When the ice sheets retreated, they left behind all this glacial till. This just gravel and sand and silt and clay all mashed together that didn't have a lot of little pores in it to store groundwater. Add to that the fact that the city was surrounded by marshes and right next to the ocean. Whenever you drew out groundwater, you'd end up getting seawater seeping in and causing wells to get solidified, so you couldn't really drink the water anymore. So as the city grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, it faced pressing issues with getting enough water. And that prompted the creation of Lake Wachusett in the 1800s. Interestingly, when they had this huge celebration with this 80-foot geyser of water issuing from a fountain in the middle of Frog Pond, the people that showed up numbered almost 55,000 people, more than the population of the city in the 1840s. So clearly Boston's grown quite a bit since then. Well, this is, I'll just make a quick note. This is Jamaica Pond, one of those other early stopgap reservoirs that they had in place. Why was Boston growing so much? This map helps to explain a little bit of it. As I said, Boston was originally a very defensible place. It was this narrow little peninsula. This dark area here shows the original area of the city of Boston. And you'll note it's a heck of a lot smaller than the Boston we know today. All throughout the 1800s, Boston filled in the marshes of the Back Bay with big piles of glacial sand mined out in places like Dedham and Newton, brought in by rail and dumped here to make this flat village for the rich. And the generally poor neighborhood of the South End, which was also filled in. But the city had so much clout that it began to annex its neighbors, taking cities that had previously been separate, like East Boston, South Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, West Roxbury, and others. Brookline, curiously enough, was the only one that actually avoided getting annexed because it ended up having so much clout with very wealthy residents that it stayed separate, refused to be annexed by Boston. Hence the weirdness where Norfolk County down here has this little detached chunk with Brookline, even today, with Boston's, street-wide width around Boston University right here today. So this kept adding more and more and more and more people, and they all needed water, plus all the factories that were opening up as this area became one of the first industrialized areas in the world. This is a map that explains the growth of the system. So Boston was sort of struggling to supply its water, and the city outstripped the resources of Lake Wachusett by the 1870s, thus had to go build a series of small reservoirs along the Sudbury River. The Sudbury Reservoir is one of them. Whitehall, Ashland, and Hopkinton are a few of the other ones. But the city couldn't afford to do this forever, and it began a process of teaming up with its neighbors, creating something called the Metropolitan District Commission in the early 1890s. This included almost all the neighboring cities, including Cambridge, ultimately, as well as Lexington, Quincy, and many other cities. This gave them added power in the State House to demand pretty much whatever they wanted, and to share the costs of new projects. So in the early 1890s, they commissioned a study to look at where they would get more water from. They looked up in Maine at Lake Sebago, up in New Hampshire at Lake Winnipesaukee, but those were both far away and in separate states. And typically, when you get into water resource stuff with other states, it ends up in the Supreme Court and becomes a huge fight. That used to be most of what the Supreme Court did for most of the 1800s, was sort of water disputes and border disputes and things like that between states, put it up to arbitration. They also looked closer to home at the Charles River and the Merrimack River. The Charles River, obviously, very close into Boston, and then the Merrimack a little bit further north. But both of those rivers were horrifyingly polluted in the early 1890s. This was still essentially 80 years before the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, and these rivers would often change color throughout the day, plus ran with raw sewage. I always find the stories that people tell growing up in Fitchburg, even as late as the late 1960s, really amusing. You know, where people would be walking to school and be like, oh, the river's pink today. That's so cool. And actually, green or something like that. Stuff that we would not accept these days. Aaron Brockovich would be down on us all. But essentially, they did find one other river that had potential, and that was the south branch of the Nashua River. The Nashua River is ultimately a tributary of the Merrimack River, and it has two branches, one up in Fitchburg and one further south in West Boylston, that all kind of come together. And the South Branch particularly, because it wasn't in Fitchburg, had very little industry, relatively speaking, and was still relatively unpolluted. And so the state, through this coalition of cities, the Metropolitan District, pushed through this plan to create a huge new reservoir. Target, West Boylston. West Boylston would ultimately be the town harmed the most by the Wachusett Reservoir project. Back in the early 1890s, it looked something like this. It was actually a pretty booming place. It had about 9 mills, each employing several hundred people, plus a number of smaller operations, including, as we'll see later on, a water-powered grist mill still grinding grain for local farmers. Now, in their case, they had the unfortunate geographic positioning to be right at basically the headwaters of the South Branch of the Nashua River. This is another view of West Boylston at this point in time. It's the Masonic Temple, one of the many churches there. You can see back in the 1890s, it looked a bit different than it did today, much more cleared land, because there was still a huge amount of farming, both livestock and grain, so much more deforested than it is today. And there was also other parcels of land with kind of unusual little businesses elsewhere along the South Branch of the Nashua River. So following the river eastward toward Boylston, Sterling, and Clinton, you would come across this guy's farm. This guy was sort of this local eccentric right over the town line in Boylston, right on the edge of Boylston and Clinton, I should say. And he had quite a bunch of stories associated with him. He was clever enough that he had taken his farm and turned it into basically a wedding venue or an events venue, and actually set up a steamer going up and down the river here to bring people to his farm. Of course, a guy as clever as this, has to have some interesting stories. And when he ultimately was among the last property owners to sell out to the state to have his property demolished and flooded, roughly just a little upstream of where the Wachusett Dam is today, he ostensibly found gold in his property. But we'll never really know because it's 120 feet below water now. Now, I want you to read this quote and think about it for a second. This is the Clinton Daily Item, which was the daily newspaper, as it would indicate, in Clinton back in the 1890s. This publication would put the modern-day New York Times to shame in terms of its length and detail of coverage for just about everything. It was a true broadsheet newspaper covering world news, as well as just about every single occurrence you could possibly think of in Clinton, most of which were very unusual and eccentric, from people going haywire on tobacco or something. Like, all kind of this weird, like, you read these bizarre stories in there, like, what the heck was going on in the 1890s in Clinton? Everyone seems like they were just the craziest characters back then. But essentially, there was a lot of trepidation about this project as it was announced. A lot of anticipation, too, because Clinton was also a city that saw itself very much at the forefront of American society. It was the capital of carpet making in the U.S., and in fact, the Bigelow Mills that were sort of the leading carpet-producing mills in the world, producing the carpets for ultimately the Titanic and many other famous ships and hotels and so forth. So almost as soon as news came out in 1893 that this project would be getting underway, teams of engineers, geologists, and surveyors, scroll back here, descended on the river. This was one of several sort of improvised barges they put together, many of them with little steam boilers on them to run drill rigs and things like that. So they began shooting points, as surveyors do, and measuring out sort of the dimensions of this new reservoir. In fact, you'll be interested to know Tower Hill Botanical Garden, draws its name from this survey. There was a tower up there for surveyors to look out from across the valley. And believe it or not, the cores they drilled with the rock down at the bottom of the river actually still exist. I've never actually laid eyes on them myself, but they are tucked away in a state warehouse someplace, I've heard tell. And apparently record that there was a huge fault right underneath the Wachusett Dam. But they weren't as wise about geological matters back 130 years ago, now were they? Speaking of geological matters, as a matter of fact, let's take a little look at Massachusetts. So this is a quick glimpse of sort of our part of the state right up here. And basically, Massachusetts, as we discovered since the discovery of plate tectonics back in the 1960s, that indicates that the continents move around over time and get assembled of all kinds of littler continents. Most of Massachusetts is actually a former little continent. It used to be about the size of Japan. This little tiny continent called Avalonia ended up docking, what they call it, onto the side of early North America almost 500 million years ago. And the pressure and temperature created by that ancient collision that brought eastern Mass, Rhode Island, and Maine ashore ended up warping and heavily deforming a lot of the rocks that are now in central Massachusetts, creating a lot of wavy patterns of rocks. These are all metamorphic rocks. They didn't quite melt, but they ended up all messed up and recrystallized and that kind of thing. So this just gives a little sense of sort of the geology that they were playing with here. A lot of granite, but also a lot of metamorphic rocks. Very tough stuff to drill through. Needed a lot of blasting. But also helped to create the valleys that they would ultimately be making this reservoir in. So back to West Boylston. I mentioned that little gristmill. Well, that's actually it right there, right by the water. This is a view of West Boylston just a couple of years later, as they were beginning to clear trees. They began with this process right away, cutting down just about all the trees, and started the process of buying up private properties. Many people actually did move their houses up to higher grounds before power lines, and especially before fiber optics, which is the real thing that screws up house moves these days, because the little glass strands in fiber optics break really easily, so no power company wants houses moved anymore. They try to make it as difficult as possible. But back then, labor was cheap, and you could just team together 30 or 40 horses and haul your house up to higher ground. So curiously, a lot of the houses that were within the path of the reservoir did actually survive on higher ground because it was so much of a pain to rebuild the house. People just thought, what the heck, we'll just put it on sleds and drag it up the hill. Howie's Gristmill was not one of those. It did get demolished, but I'll just point out in the foreground you can see some of these tree stumps here. We'll see in a second even more of that. This is the view across the river. Again, you can see a lot of clearing going on, even some smoke in the distance, most likely, as they began to burn piles, as the state began to burn piles of wood left over from this clearing operation. But it wasn't just knocking down trees and houses. To build this reservoir would require rechanneling the entire valley. At the time, this was actually the largest civil engineering project in human history, although a British project in then British India vied for the title of the biggest project as they built their own reservoir that was almost the same size as Wachusett. They duke it out over the title. But it still holds the distinction of being the largest hand-dug reservoir in history, because workers really were out there with picks and shovels, loading up soil into little carts like this. A narrow gauge railway served the entire valley. So workers would gather soil in wagons and haul them with mules up to these big shafts up here and dump them down into these passing carts to be hauled off and heaped up as earthen dams to hold back the water. Again, I mentioned how much wood was generated by the clearing of the landscape. Look at how many cords of wood are just in this one photo alone. You have to think somebody must have cashed in pretty big on all that firewood. This is a very active image, one of my favorites actually of the project, because it captures so much in one view. Here's that narrow gauge railway we talked about. And you can actually see, I think, that this was actually a railway in constant motion. It would actually have workers, as I believe maybe going on here, pick up the tracks and move them a few feet side to side, so the railway was constantly moving to keep up with where they were digging. And here's some of those carts we mentioned a second ago for hauling off soil. So where was all this soil ending up? Well, a lot of it ended up in Sterling and Boylston. This is actually right on the Clinton-Sterling line. And this is a very rare view. This shows the assembly of the North Dyke. Today, you can walk along the North Dyke. It's pretty much all clear, and it's this big, very even soil embankment that holds back the water along the relatively low-lying north side of the reservoir on the Clinton-Sterling line. A lot of people go fishing there, go walking there. This actually shows this particular site as it was getting filled in, and you can see the 60-foot deep sort of sheeting that they put in to prevent water flowing through and weakening this dike. As it turns out, this was actually unsuccessful. A large wave in a very wet year knocked out part of this dike in 1906, but they did fix it and patch things up, and it's never had a problem since. So to put the North Dyke in perspective, as they were putting this all together, this is, again, before the water even began to fill. This is where you would stand up there today with this riprap, this rough stone used as a wave break that pretty much this would be the water line right now. And then these guys down here with their surveying poles would be about 60 feet below water if they were to stand there today. This is the very first stone laid for the Wachusett Dam. The Wachusett Dam is really sort of the crowning achievement in some ways of the Wachusett project. I always think of it like the Hoover Dam or something like that, scaled to fit our state. And at the time, it was a really impressive technological achievement. Nobody built a dam that big ever at that point in time. To get this project done, they ended up rechanneling the National River to make the riverbed dry, sort of using these sluices to get the water around, and then blasted out about 25 feet deep into the rock bed at the bottom of the river, and then began to fill that in with stone. Most of the interior stone was actually from the small quarry that we'll see in a second, while the exterior stone was brought in from Chelmsford. Believe it or not, Chelmsford is actually pretty much the hub of mining in Massachusetts today, unless you count the gypsum mines out west, or the mine in North Adams where they dig up marble to make tums, believe it or not. But these days, right back on the highway, right when you're driving through Chelmsford, just where you can't quite see it through the trees, are a whole bunch of huge granite quarries. They tend to produce a lot of the high-quality granite that you see as curbing in most towns in New England. And back then, they provided the higher-end sort of cut stone for the exterior of the Wachusett Dam. So this very first stone, when it was laid, sank into some mud, and a foreman actually had his men wrestle with it for most of the day. The guy has been a total perfectionist to get this thing straightened out with chains. And when finally, 5 or 6 hours later, they were all done, he said, "All right, take a break." And everyone started smashing off bits of the rocks over here. So I'm sure some of these little chunks of granite are still out there somewhere. I hope they have a label on them to tell us that very first stone. So this is a few months later, perhaps even a year later, and it shows the progress of this lower basement section of the dam. These are 48-inch pipes that would be used to sort of move water through the bottom of the dam, through turbines, and then out into the river, which would be out here. Again, this whole thing is dry right here. The entire river rechanneled for this project. This is another fascinating image. This shows the downstream park, actually designed by the famous landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who also designed Boston's Emerald Necklace. This is the fountain, although no water flowing out of it yet. This poor mule or horse is awfully thirsty. Seems to be eyeing that fountain expectantly. So I mentioned quarry. Well, this is one of the images. This is that quarry in Boylston that supplied all the interior stone to make the dam. So as the project went along, the state erected these huge gantries on either side of the valley with a cableway running between them. Huge baskets, probably a quarter the size of this room, used to carry these big slabs of stone and put them in place. You can actually see them in action here in this great Library of Congress image. This shows that cableway up and running, these workers assembling stones on these platforms and putting them into place. And in the foreground, you can see the powerhouse beginning to take shape. I always like to point out this other image actually captures maybe a few weeks or a few months earlier, because the power station doesn't yet have that beginnings of roof we saw a second ago. This image was taken from the viaduct, which we'll touch on in 1 second, and looks out across the valley here. I'm always fascinated to look at this landscape and see how barren it looks back there. You can tell that already there's quite a bit of clearing of the ground, and a huge amount of soil had already been moved from the valley upstream. So that trestle, where we saw that photo from a second ago, that was another big element of the project. You see, in the lead-up to the project, one of the main railroad routes across New England was actually running right along the National River. This ran from Boston to Northampton and had to be completely moved to make way for the dam and the reservoir to follow. And so this became a huge undertaking, all paid for, again, by the state. And it involved tearing up about 7 or 8 miles, I'd say, of railroad track, and creating this huge trestle viaduct and a rail tunnel. The rail tunnel is actually still there. You can still walk through it, believe it or not. It's one of those sort of low-hanging fruit for urban exploration for those that don't mind going through a rather spooky cavern of sorts. In this image, you can see all the girders heaped up here to begin assembling that rail trestle, as well as the pillars in the river. These, curiously, are still there. They're actually the last bit of the trestle that remains. The trestle was knocked down in the mid-1970s when the railroad was shut down. And in fact, the book that I have for sale at the back has the only images of it being torn down, which were pulled off of a video taken at the time, kindly contributed by a local resident. So when that project was done, the train began to run basically just in front of the dam, going to and from Northampton from Boston. This was actually apparently the favorite railroad of Calvin Coolidge, a native of Northampton, who would take this route very often to go to deal with state business in Boston as governor. And I love that in the 1890s, there was such an emphasis on infrastructure that we don't have today. Could you imagine sending your cousin or something like that? Look at this beautiful I-93 tunnel in downtown Boston. It's beautiful. The roof hasn't caved in since 2004. But that was the way that postcard making was back then. They would make these carefully hand-colorized postcards, and it captures so much here. You can actually see those gantries still in place for the construction of the dam. So by 1905, the construction of the dam itself was complete. This marked the laying of the very last stone for this part of the project. This would serve as a template for many other huge engineering projects at that time. The engineers that would go on to design and build the Panama Canal, which was sort of going on right around the time the dam got finished, actually came to visit before getting underway with the Panama Canal to see what a huge engineering project like this would look like. Ultimately, when it was all said and done, the interior, the sort of guts of the dam, if you want, looked something like this. Essentially, the water level is up to about here on the back end of the dam, the upstream face. And this central penstock brings in water from an upstream intake, takes it below ground through those 48-inch pipes we saw earlier back in the basement section, and for many, many years was used to run huge turbines and then generators producing electricity in the powerhouse. Then from there, it would flow out mostly to the Wachusett aqueduct to take that water toward Boston, and some of it would be released into the National River. These days, of course, the power station is no longer operating, although the huge Westinghouse generators from over 100 years ago are still in place there, too big to take out of that building. And much of the water actually still flows from here out into the river. They didn't waste any time with completing some of the beautification that came with the project. Olmsted and his team went ahead and completed this downstream park very quickly after the dam was completed, with beautiful, beautiful results. I wish that we had more of a focus like this with infrastructure today. Things have tended to be very utilitarian in many ways over the last few decades, and don't often take a chance to celebrate how amazing it is to have clean water. This really was such a breakthrough. Huge cities like Paris, which were quite wealthy in the 1800s, was still plagued by cholera at the time that we became one of the first cities in the US to have truly clean drinking water, and really kind of placed ourselves among the first in the world to have that distinction. This is another beautiful postcard. Again, I love that colorization, detail. This shows just a little further downstream. This captures that trestle bridge and then completed park and dam. We're going to shift focus for a second. You know about the people that actually built this. We thought a little bit about the high-level stuff, the clearing of the land, the building of the dam, the engineering of it all. But what about the people that were actually down on the ground making this happen? Well, down on the ground might be the best word for it. This is an example of one of several shanty towns that the largely Italian worker base lived in. At this point in time, New England was already a state. New England and Massachusetts were very much in transition. High levels of immigration from Ireland had taken place almost half a century or 60 years earlier at the time of the Irish potato famine. So many of the Irish immigrants were actually very established and tended to work in roles often in city services or in manufacturing. And at this point in time, it was new arrivals from Italy who were sort of the bulk of the new immigrants to the U.S. that ended up at the lowest end of the totem pole in terms of jobs. And that meant taking the grueling work on building the dam and building the reservoir. They were joined by others, in fact, including some workers from Finland and Eastern Europe, and even some African Americans escaping from the Jim Crow South to a better life in the North, who, unfortunately, because of the racial politics of the time, ended up with the most dangerous jobs doing the blasting to create the rail tunnel and the aqueduct. So they had the highest death rate of any of the workers from industrial accidents. So as you can imagine, looking at this squalid condition, this was a very hazardous line of work to be in, with very challenging circumstances. That was made all the more challenging by the fact that this project came to be sort of dominated in these Italian shanty towns by essentially crooked wheeling-dealing people. Italy, back in the mid-1800s, had been sort of a lawless place. The Catholic Church was, with the Papal States, was trying to hold on to power. And to do it, they'd spun up all kinds of militias and crooks and all kinds of gangs and bandits and stuff back in Italy to try to hang on to power. A lot of these people went on to become the 'Ndrangheta, the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, all these famous organized crime groups that then came to dominate a lot of places in Europe and the U.S. in the 20th century. Well, it wasn't quite the Mafia, but there were some awfully crooked people involved in supplying provisions to these Italian workers. Padrones, as they were called, were these earlier arrivals that essentially became camp bosses. Workers were required to pay enormous sums for the most basic goods to survive. Many of them were impoverished, even more than their circumstances would indicate. It's actually interesting, and I'll give you a second to see if you can recognize this gentleman right here. Anybody? This is...
Might be Curly.
Close. Actually, one of his predecessors. You're on the right track there. This is David Ignatius Walsh, originally from Lancaster, who was Massachusetts' first Catholic governor. He was actually, at this point in time, a young attorney based in the Clinton area, and he took pity on these Italian workers who were dealing with these very crooked camp bosses, basically taking advantage of them, and actually managed to call a hearing on Beacon Hill to investigate this whole system. An early example of labor activism bringing about large-scale investigations and kind of sort of fact-finding missions that did begin to improve the quality of life for workers. So while things were certainly very, very difficult in the camps, it is important to remember that these workers did have a chance to make it as new Americans in the Wachusett Project. While things were certainly very arduous, I look at this image of all these workers posing with their pneumatic drills and their rather unimpressed mules, and I have to think that many of these people, this was their ticket to freedom and a much better life, even if the initial project was very, very difficult to work on. Many of the unskilled laborers that had come directly from Italy or Eastern Europe ended up settling in Central Mass, setting up families here and setting deep ties in the region. So many, many people in Central Mass trace their roots to the people that arrived to work on this project. I will also just mention the skilled laborers that worked on this project. This gentleman right here appears to be cutting one of these huge slabs of stone, most likely for inclusion in the dam. Looks a little bit peeved that somebody took him away from his work. And then this guy appears to be some kind of operating engineer, most likely running the spools of cable for the huge cableway. There were a number of engineers and skilled masons and other professions like that that worked on the project, but many of them actually pulled up stakes afterward and didn't have as much of a long-lasting impact in Central Mass because they ended up taking the train as soon as the project was done, all the way to New York to work on the Croton Reservoir, which is basically the twin of Wachusett that helps supply some of New York City's water. So many of them didn't really stick around in the area. So by 1908, the water level had risen behind the dam. The project was essentially complete, and the reservoir began sending water to Boston. Over the next 32 years, Wachusett would be the primary source of water for Boston, and also a major tourist attraction. This is long before Disney World, long before cheap air travel, long before people could go much of any place far from home. And so for early motorists, or those taking the train, or even walking in some cases, this was a great chance to go visit, go for a picnic at the park by the dam. So for many, many decades, this was a huge sort of tourist attraction in central Mass. Quabbin. Now, how does Quabbin fit into all of this? I joke sometimes that Quabbin is a cottage industry for just about anybody that writes about New England history. I'm proud to say I have not written a book about Quabbin. I'm never going to. It's a study-to-death field. There's probably about 50 or 60 books at this point. All fascinating, but they've tended to leave out the prior story of the Wachusett, which is part of what prompted me to pursue this project in the first place. Now, Boston continued to grow in population, including the surrounding cities, all throughout the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. Many people forget that the 1920s were actually the single biggest economic boom in American history, and a huge boom in population, too. And so they continued to have more and more and more water challenges. Didn't help that there were some drought years in the mix, which made things all more complicated. And so very soon they began looking further west for even more water. In this case, the engineers that had designed and built the Wachusett, including a gentleman named Xanthus Goodnow from Brookline, ended up setting their sights on the small Swift River, a tributary of the Connecticut River. Xanthus was actually an avid fly fisherman, but had a bad habit of damming up all the rivers that he was fishing in, the Swift River included. So by the late 1920s, there was a project underway to create this vast, new, much shallower but much larger reservoir called Quabbin. Unfortunately, this was accompanied by a period of intense political corruption. Basically, for most of the 1920s to 1940s, a sequence of corrupt, insanely corrupt, like Venezuela-level corrupt, Boston mayors were running the state. Basically, all with deep pockets to their allies. And James Michael Curley, the most colorful of the bunch, was mayor first and then governor at the time that this project was underway, and handed out all the contracts to his cronies. So it ended up becoming a much more expensive and much more convoluted project than many had anticipated it would be. But essentially, throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, the state famously disbanded, completely disincorporated 4 entire towns, knocked down virtually all the buildings, and began to flood the region to create the vast Quabbin Reservoir. How does the Quabbin project stack up relative to Wachusett? Although Wachusett did not actually sort of terminate any towns or anything like that, it is interesting to note that the actual number of people displaced was very similar. It was about 3,000 people with Wachusett, about 4,000 with Quabbin because of the slightly higher population density further east and around Clinton and West Boylston. So even as Quabbin came online in the early 1940s, the region began to face some familiar challenges, namely water pollution. Part of what had gotten us all into this mess in the first place was the water pollution at hand in the Charles River and the Merrimack, which had forced the city to look further and further and further west for water. Well, many of the close into the city reservoirs began to become quite polluted. First among them, the Sudbury Reservoir, which was polluted by something called the Nyanza chemical plant with heavy metals. A neighboring plant had dumped all kinds of heavy metals and that kind of thing into the water. And this was enough of a problem in the 1940s that they had to build the Haltman Aqueduct, an entire aqueduct cutting through the ground below the reservoir through bedrock to rechannel water from Wachusett so it wouldn't come in contact with the polluted Sudbury Reservoir water. This is an example of that construction going on during roughly the World War II time frame. Well, I saw a photo in the back of the famous Old Stone Church. I think it's a good interlude to go talk about the Old Stone Church. Well, the Old Stone Church came about because the Baptist Church in West Boylston burnt down in 1890. It had been a wooden church, torched, pure to cinders on the ground. And the Baptist Church had a lot of money in their coffers, and they thought, we're going to build a church that will last 1,000 years. Well, it ended up lasting them about 3 before the state came in and took it from them, and they had to move to higher ground, unfortunately. However, because it was a stone structure, one of the few fully stone structures within the bed of the reservoir, it was allowed to stay standing because it was presumed that wooden structures would break apart, eventually rot, and clog intakes, but the stone one would cause no trouble. So they let it stay standing, and it quickly became sort of this haunting memory of the village of Oakdale, which had preceded the reservoir there. And this site ended up going through a number of different iterations. It fell into horrifying disrepair in the 1960s and 70s and actually collapsed around 1975. Luckily, though, citizens took action in West Boylston. They didn't want to see this landmark go to waste and be gone forever. And so they actually got enough money together to go and rebuild it with much better trusses inside to keep it standing. And so today, this is one of the few structures left in the bed of the reservoir. In fact, by some standards, the only one that precedes the construction of the reservoir and tells of that time before. Now, in more recent years, in 1990, 1992, Massachusetts finally got rid of what had been called for decades the Metropolitan District Commission, or MDC. Actually, if you go to Boston, you'll still see all the manhole covers. They'll say MDC on them because they haven't replaced them. But there was a whole resorting and reformation of state agencies. And the functions of the MDC were split between two new agencies. The Mass Water Resources Authority, which actually controls the water quality and the dams and the reservoir and the aqueducts and so forth. And then DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, which is in charge of all the buffer lands and conservation lands around the reservoir today. Now, this is a good map of the system as it stands today. Obviously, in the years after Quabbin's construction, a major aqueduct, basically as large as a subway tunnel, was set up to link Quabbin and the western edge of Wachusett. From there, the old Wachusett aqueduct, which had served with a mix of tunnels and open channels for decades, was abandoned because it was seen as being too likely to get polluted or intentionally polluted by terrorists. And a series of huge, deep aqueducts have been put in place, now channeling water from Wachusett up into the metro area from here. A number of different cities draw water from Wachusett. During peak times, Worcester can draw from Wachusett, although it typically doesn't most days of the year. Pretty much all the cities and towns to the east of Wachusett draw a combination of water from Quabbin and Wachusett. It takes, on average, about 7 years for a gallon of water to get from Quabbin to Boston. It's projected, so it's quite a journey for those little water molecules to make it so it's Boston in the Back Bay. This is the Cosgrove Treatment Facility. As water quality became a higher priority in the 1960s, as the Clean Water Act loomed, there was a shift toward having an on-site water treatment plant. So this was positioned just up the shore from the Wachusett Dam, and is actually the intake point for all those new aqueducts that now take the water from Wachusett eastward. This is actually a view of one of those deep aqueducts right around the time of its construction in 1999-2000. And while the Wachusett aqueduct served with distinction for the better part of the century, there have been a few hiccups with this, including one in 2010, where a huge pipe coupling burst in Weston, temporarily disconnecting Boston from its western water sources and prompting boil water orders for a few days until they could get it reconnected. So as we've seen, Wachusett is an integral piece of water in Massachusetts, but also part of a much broader web of stories. And at this point, I will turn it over to questions. Yes?
We lived in Newton when the construction of the additional water tank was taking place, and we well remember when the burst happened because it tied everything up all over and it affected our water supply. There is, adjacent to the Mass Turnpike, there is, I think, a covered retention, I'll call it retention reservoir or something. Could you talk about that?
Yeah.
Because you can't really see it.
Exactly.
It's
right as you come up the hill toward the Interstate 95 interchange, right where you crest the hill and come to Boston. There's a new covered small aqueduct, or excuse me, small reservoir that was put in place there around 2001, 2002, I think. And that serves, I think, sort of a staging role for bringing water in from some of the aqueducts that tie into it from there and then flowing it downhill. Whenever possible, engineers try to get things to flow with gravity because it's so expensive to build pump stations to haul water up over hills. So I think it serves sort of a staging role. Yes?
You said that people lost their homes because this happened. Were they ever compensated?
They were compensated. There was a formula that tried to take into account the market valuation of their properties, and so all the people were paid out for the land they lost. This was at a period in time where basically eminent domain powers were much stronger in the U.S. than they are now, and it was much less recourse for people to challenge that in court than there would be today. Obviously, eminent domain takings still happen, but these days they're pretty uncommon in New England, and that large of one would be pretty much impossible because it'd probably be a century of litigation before you actually take anyone's property. Yes?
I grew up in West Boylston. Just a couple of things. My grandmother always called the reservoir, she called it the fill.
Mm.
And it never made sense to me, the fill, because I thought they had to dig it out, but then they filled it. So, right, with water. So that's just kind of interesting.
I'm always fascinated by the stories that people tell of their own recollections, many cases of 80 or 90 years living by the reservoir. Apparently during World War II, the water level was lowered quite a bit, either because of a drought or because of some kind of concerns about sabotage or the dam being ruptured in some way. So parts of the shallow end of the reservoir, the former village of Oakdale, where it narrows in West Boylston, that you're describing right where the old stone church is, that was actually dry land again for a little bit, at least very mucky dry land. So one person recalled walking out there and finding all these old cellar holes and streets that were still in place there from only, at the time, 40 or 45 years earlier. So pretty fascinating stuff like that. They even, in many cases, left entire bridges in place out in the reservoir, which caused some consternation about 10 or 15 years ago when someone thought that a plane had crashed in the reservoir. They kept getting this huge metal anomaly. They're like, oh my goodness, there's a plane down there. And they went down this bridge. But all kinds of things that are probably waiting to be discovered down there for the few people that can get permission from the state to go diving in there. We got to see some videos. Darn it. Yes?
So how many years did it take to build the dam, and did anybody get hurt?
So there were a few people killed in the process of the dam's creation. I don't know exact numbers. They didn't separate out by which part of the project people were killed. My guess is probably 3 or 4 people in the process of building that, but I couldn't say for sure. And the actual construction of the dam ran from 1895 to 1905, so about 10 years. Yes?
Why don't they use the power plant anymore?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to relatively old equipment, and you'd have to do a lot of disassembly and then reassembly to put something in there. I know there's also, in some ways, it may not generate that much electricity to make it worth it in current cost-benefit analysis kind of accounting. But it should be nice to see them generate power again there. I know there's been some discussion of doing that at some point.
So the church is down under the water?
So it's right up at the water's edge. It's basically within the bed of the reservoir, as the engineers termed it, but not actually below water level.
Okay, so they didn't have to rebuild it with divers.
That would be awfully impressive if they'd done that. Yes?
When they fix the church, is it nice, like, I went in there years ago, and it was awful. It was like all pigeons and
It's still the same way.
Is that how it is?
If you when people have their weddings in there, probably dodging.
That was nasty.
It looks mostly white against the wedding dress, right?
I go through Oakdale quite often, actually, sometimes on the way to Tower Hill, which, thanks for that little bit of information with us. But some of the houses, having said that houses were moved and thinking of coming off of 190 onto 140 and through Oakdale, some of those homes seem to be, tucked up there. Some of those...
Almost certainly. A lot of houses in downtown Boylston, or downtown West Boylston, are actually houses that were moved. I'm not sure the exact final tally of how many ended up being moved to higher ground and how many that survived the intervening century, but certainly dozens probably were moved to higher ground. Again, it was much cheaper to do that back then than it is now. And I'll put a quick plug out. If anyone's interested in buying a copy of the book, there are copies for sale at the back for $20. Happy to sign as well. Great. Oh, actually.
Yeah, what sort of public access opportunities are there today on the water and the land surrounding?
Yeah, so the state, unfortunately, is very protective of the Wachusett Reservoir. In fact, they've actually added a lot of buffer land around it since 2000 by eminent domain takings or purchases and that kind of thing. So such a concern about water quality these days. sadly, due to a spate of suicides and then all of the post 9/11 concerns, they shut off the walkway on top of the dam. And it was fully closed for a number of years. Now they open it usually once or twice a year to the public. Typically, Columbus Day actually is the date that you usually pick to open it, which is a great chance to go and explore it. A really cool view from up there. As far as public access, though, once you get a couple of miles back of the dam on the southern shore, you can actually go, and there's trails and stuff you can walk around. The north shore is a little bit more accessible. You can actually walk the old path of the railroad from where the trestle bridge would have come across all the way along the shore to the North Dike, and then there's a whole set of trails that continue on the other side all the way to West Boylston. And curiously, actually, if you know where to look, there's even the remnants of the old sort of pest house for Clinton, the old cellar holes in the woods just right by the water where they used to house tuberculosis and smallpox cases back in the 19th century. Another little ruin within the state's property there. Yes?
Where is that? I walk along there.
Yeah, so in terms of placing it, it is just over, I think it's just over the town line into West Boylston on the north shore of the reservoir. So a little bit past, heading westward toward West Boylston, a little bit past the inlet, the North Dike, where everyone goes fishing. There's some kind of crossroad that comes in right there. I'm forgetting the name. But if you ask at the ranger station, they'll undoubtedly point it out to you. And the Clinton Historical Society or West Boylston Historical Society would almost certainly know the answer to that question. Yes, sir?
What's the flow of cubic feet out of that reservoir every day?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. Certainly, probably millions of cubic feet of water. A huge, huge amount of water moves out of Wachusett every single day. I think it's probably on the order of billions of gallons alone that Boston consumes, to say nothing of the other MWRA communities around it.
Do you happen to know the surface area in acres?
In acres I don't, square miles I do.
Okay.
It's about 7 square miles with Wachusett, about, I think it's almost 140 square miles with Quabbin, so quite a difference, but volumetrically they're actually very similar because Wachusett's actually quite a bit deeper. You can always tell how deep the reservoir is by looking at the dam, because the water has to be roughly that tall behind it. So the water at the dam is about 120 feet deep because the dam is a little bit over 120 feet deep, 120 feet tall. And so it actually deepens quite a bit as you get closer to the dam in Wachusett, whereas Quabbin in general is pretty shallow, rarely over 30, 40, 50 feet. So it actually sums up to about the same amount of water in both.
Has there ever need to be a major, maintenance done on the dam, or is it just sort of,
They built things to last in the 1890s, which I can't say for the rebar.
Maybe is it expected to last another 100?
So in current projection, I don't see why it couldn't still be there, in Roman timescales. 2,000 or 3,000 years from now, it's probably still going to be doing just fine. It's the newer stuff we have to worry about. As far as I know, the only really big work they've done recently is they installed some new controls on the huge overflow just to the north side of the dam. They have a spillway there, huge, wider than this building, with essentially plane wings that come up and down to control the flow of water, so they can let water out from behind the dam if there's a huge spring snowmelt or something like that. And the other thing that they did about 10 years ago was they did a whole process of stripping the front of the dam very carefully because they discovered that there was some PCBs, those nasty carcinogens on the front of it, so they took those out of there, and now it's clean, I guess. That's about it in terms of the dam itself.
It must have been lowered substantially during the drought of, when was the drought, 5 years ago?
Yeah, I don't know how much the water levels went down with that. Probably a few feet would be my guess.
More, but
Yeah. We certainly have, we're still such a wet and rainy state that we have nothing like the crazy drying out of dams that you see out in California or Arizona in the south and stuff like that with some of the recent droughts there, where the whole reservoir goes away pretty much, and everyone's like, oh, geez, that's Bobby's car from 1972. That's where it went.
the Mid-Atlantic states also, I remember much longer ago, dried out so much that reservoirs were dry. People had to walk across them. Clearly, they were shallower, but
I know Massachusetts had a very sustained drought in the 1960s, 10 years of very, very, very low rainfall. And there was actually discussion at that point in time of potentially even building a third leg, an additional aqueduct to run to the Connecticut and haul water from there. But they ended up abandoning those plans at that point in time because then the 70s and 80s turned out to be a lot wetter than the 60s had been.
I apologize if you told us in the beginning that I was a couple minutes late. What inspired your interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, what kind of got me interested is I've always been fascinated by history, particularly our regional history. And I'm somebody that loves to tell stories that haven't been told before. I was always very intrigued by the story of Quabbin. You know, the demolition, complete elimination of these 4 towns. Is a pretty interesting and unusual story. To say nothing of the human elements of the story, all the engineering and the workers and the people displaced and so forth. But before too long, I began to wonder, what about Wachusett? I was actually more familiar with Wachusett going into it, because as I was reading all these Quabbin books, I was like, well, you know, Wachusett, I know about that, I hiked there. And I started to look for a book on Wachusett, and was stunned to find that there wasn't a book on Wachusett. And so this really got me pretty interested, and I began to look into it more and more and more. And I came to discover that there was actually a lot of material out there, hundreds or even thousands of photographs, all from every aspect of the project, journal entries, state records, newspaper reports, all kinds of things like that. But nobody had bothered to tie them together, and I kind of fell into the trap of doing the detective work on it all until it became a book. So that was sort of my process with it about 10 years ago. And I've loved telling the story ever since, and every single time I tell it, there's a new wrinkle on it that I learned from the people I'm talking with.
John, how long did it take you to write?
6 months to write it, and then 6 months to edit it. At the time, the editing was the hardest part. Now I work as an editor, so that would be the easiest part. So, but at the time, that was the stumbling block, was going through and making sure all the photos were sized right, and not every other word was misspelled.
Is the park still there?
It is, yeah. That park, you're welcome to go and walk around it. That's the part of the project that's still wide open to the public. Everyone's still invited to come check that out.
And who maintains it?
That's maintained by DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. They're sort of like our state's National Park Service, basically.
Was there a deliberate effort to reforest, or was it just natural?
It was deliberate, yeah. It's actually, you can often tell the mark of a state water project by an unusually large number of pine trees. They really, really, really like pine trees because they don't dump leaves as much, which they always think are going to rot, clog up their water, foul fresh water supply. So there's these huge stands of pine trees around a lot of the reservoir, many of which date back to when they reforested right after the project. All that reforestation also helps to limit erosion, which you don't want. You don't want soil clogging up intakes or dams failing or anything like that. These days, they're a little more amenable to what the botanists call mixed forests. You know, it's deciduous and coniferous trees all in one go, particularly as they've acquired a lot of new lands as buffer since the 1990s.
Is there any silting problem?
You know, I don't know the extent of silting in Wachusett. Probably somewhat one, although it's certainly a pretty deep reservoir, so it's got that going for it. I think all the intakes are relatively close to the surface, so they don't tend to silt up as much as they might in other dams. A big problem for a lot of dams, particularly those built in the 60s and afterward, is that they're very prone to silting up because a lot of their water intakes are actually down at the bottom of the dam instead of close to the top. So naturally, where all the silt and sediment and stuff like that builds up, which can clog all the turbines and that kind of thing, or prevent water flowing through properly, is a huge issue out west in a lot of the dams there, where the Federal Bureau of Reclamation is constantly attempting to dredge these things out to no avail every few years. I saw a hand in the back as well.
Yeah, we wanted to check out that tunnel. Where would we have to go?
Yeah, so the tunnel is basically just a little down the hill from the dam. And you can basically just park on the side of the road. It's pretty obvious from the road. There's like a little sort of stone promontory that comes up right to the road's edge. You just walk up there and go ahead and walk right in. I believe it's all still on state property, or if it's on private property, they don't care if you walk through.
Which road?
You know, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's
Route 70.
Route 70, thank you.
I don't guarantee it, but
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right. It's the road out of town, basically the only road out of town is at Boylston, so.
Yeah. Second.
Great, well,
Okay,
seeing no other questions, I will leave it there. Thank you all so much for coming out and joining us.